Hello students, it's your history teacher and I'm here with another online lecture. To study with me today you need to open your book History is Not a Mystery on the page 161. Title is World War II Part 3 and we will also talk about Part 4 and the main topic will be the major battles of World War II. Here in the presentation, there is mentioned, for example, London Blitzkrieg. That was this Battle of Britain I mentioned in the previous video. Pearl Harbor, that was the incident after which the USA got involved in World War II. And the first battle I will mention today will be Battle of Midway. You know, at the beginning of the year 1942, the Allies, mostly the Soviet Union, the USA, and Great Britain were in desperate situation. The US Navy was destroyed in Pearl Harbor. Germany and Italy were victorious in Northern Africa. The USSR was almost defeated in Operation Barbarossa, so the invasion of Germany to the Soviet Union. But then, so-called turning points of the 1942, because all of these battles I will mention happened in this year, were turning points in this situation. So it means that all of these battles were won by the Allies and so changed the course of the war. Battle of Midway happened between 4th and the 7th of June 1942, approximately 6 months after the Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States Navy decisively defeated Imperial Japanese Navy attack against Midway Atoll, that is in the Central Pacific. The Japanese planned to attack the island of Midway, expanding their hold on the Central Pacific. American intelligence intercepted Japanese plans and knew of the impending Japanese attacks. In this battle were 4 Japanese carriers, 2 battleships, and 15 other ships sunk by the Americans. Japanese lost 248 planes, and the American Navy losses were a lot lower. Only 1 aircraft carrier and 1 destroyer sunk, 150 aircraft destroyed. So this battle is specifically known as the turning point of the Pacific. So in this war that was happening between the United States of America and Japan. You do not need to know the specific numbers. I want you to know that it was won by the Americans. It happened in 1942. It was the turning point of the Pacific. The American losses were a lot lower than the Japanese ones. The Midway Islands are in the Central Pacific, so the Japanese was expanding to Central Pacific. And because these islands were American ones, so they belonged to the United States, Japanese wanted to attack them. But the American intelligence intercepted this plan. Okay, so this collecting of the intelligence helped a lot. Okay, now we'll move to the Battle of Stalingrad. It's not in the presentation, it's just in your book, but it's very important battle. So as you can know, according to the name, Stalingrad is in Russia. It was named after Stalin. Its former name was Volgograd, just by the way. And during the year 1942, German forces proceeded in Soviet Union. Why they did this? You know, Germany needed the natural resources that the Soviet Union had. This was a great advantage of the USSR. Their natural resources and also their population, that was huge. So as they proceeded, they conquered Crimea, and their next attack was led to the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea because of the oil. And also they had one direction of its army that wanted to go to Moscow because it's capital, and they also sieged the Leningrad, the St. Petersburg. Okay, so one direction was to Leningrad, one to Moscow, and one to Kaliningrad, so to the Caucasus. Stalingrad was the strategic point and a symbol, so city on the Volga River. Since the August 27, 1942, the German army that was led by General Friedrich Paulus had been trying to conquer the city. Hard fights in urbanized area, so city, were very cruel. The battle was led in ruined houses, factories, even in the sewerage system. Only a few square kilometers were being defended by the Red Army, but Stalin's command was clear. The Germans must have been defeated, mostly because the city carried his name and was symbol of his cult of personality. In winter 1942, the German forces were surrounded and their situation became hopeless. They had no ammunition, weapons, fuel, not even food supplies. The promise of Goering, who was the leader of Luftwaffe, so the Air Force, was to transport all supplies via airplanes, but it could not be realized. General Paulus was promoted to a marshal position, and never in German history any marshal had been captured by enemy before. But in January 1943, the German 6th Army capitulated. 300,000 skilled veterans of the war were killed or became prisoners of the war. Only a few thousand of these men survived. So again, this war was won by the Allies, by the USSR. Germany was defeated. It was the second turning point of the 1942. The German army was proceeding in three directions, to Leningrad, Moscow and Stalingrad. The fighting took place exactly in the city, so in this urbanized area, and it was very cruel. The Germans were basically defeated by the Russian winter once more. They were without any supplies, and the rest of the German army in Stalingrad was captured. Okay, so I want you to remember that. I will move to the next, Battle of El Alamein. It was the fight in the deserts of the North Africa, and it is nowadays seen as one of the decisive victories of the World War II, even though it's maybe not so well known as Stalingrad. The Battle of El Alamein was primarily fought between the two outstanding commanders of the World War II, and this is General Montgomery and Rommel. Rommel was called Desert Fox. Please write it down. This was his nickname because he was fighting in Africa and he was really good at it. Okay, so Desert Fox. When I will ask who is it, it's Rommel, German general. General Montgomery was from Great Britain. The Allied victory at El Alamein led to the retreat of the Afrika Korps that were led by Desert Fox Erwin Rommel, and the German surrender in North Africa in May of 1943. And the last battle I will mention as the turning point of 1942, even though it happened in 1943, but this battle is very important, was the Battle of Kursk. This was the last attempt of Germany to defeat Red Army of the USSR, but they failed. In this biggest tank battle in the world history, they were fighting amongst 2.8 million soldiers, 8,000 tanks and 5,000 planes. The Soviets won this battle and it was really decisive. It was the real beginning of the end of the World War II. In summer 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily and Italy. Behind all of that fighting, there were also conferences of the Allies where their procedures to Germany were introduced. The first of these conferences was the Tehran Conference. In this conference, Joseph Stalin for the USSR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the USA, and Winston Churchill for Great Britain met in 1943. In Tehran, Iran. We call these main representatives the Big Three, and they discussed this matter. Operation Overlord would be launched during May 1944. This operation should end World War II in Europe. The military staff of the three powers should from then on keep in close touch with each other. The borders of post-war Poland were determined along the Oder and Ness rivers. United Nations Organization was tentatively agreed to establish. The Soviet Union agreed to wage war against Japan. So these are the most important matters. Okay, I can also ask about that. So Tehran Conference is important to know. You do not need to remember the specific date, just that it was in 1943. So just the year. Then the representatives and the main matters that were discussed during this conference. Okay, now turn the page to 163 to World War II Part 4. So, as was negotiated in the Tehran Conference, the invasion of Normandy, or the Operation Overlord, okay, so it's the same thing, started in June 1944. It's also called the D-Day. So this invasion began with overnight parachute and glider landings, massive air attacks, naval bombardments, early morning amphibious landings on 5 beaches: Juneau, Gold, Omaha, Utah, and Sword. You do not need to remember the specific names of the beaches. In fact, they were not called like that. They just gave them these names as to strategic points. Okay, important for me is to know that it was in Normandy, in the northern France, and that it happened on June the 6th, 1944. Okay, so the whole date I want to know. So it was Operation Overlord, D-Day, or Normandy invasion. By this, the Western Front was reopened because, as we know, when the France capitulated, the Western Front basically stopped existing, and the USSR really needed the Western Front to reopen because all of the Germans could fight only in the Eastern Front. So this invasion was led by the General Eisenhower, and regardless of bad weather that day, almost 160,000 soldiers were landed during the first day. At the end of June, 1 million Allied soldiers fought in France. In August, the Free French forces invaded the southern France. By the end of autumn 1944, France was liberated. The liberation of the Netherlands and Belgium was more difficult, especially the Ardennes offensive was dangerous German counteroffensive, but finally the German forces were defeated there. So we can say that this Ardennes offensive was the last offensive of Germany, so the last counterattack. In 1944, the USSR disposed of the army of 7 million soldiers. In 1944, Kiev was liberated and the Red Army crossed the border with Germany. But Germany still resisted strongly, so these fightings were really bloody in Eastern and Central Europe, also in our territory. The second conference that happened during the World War II was the Yalta Conference. This was the last meeting of Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin for the purpose of discussing Europe's post-war reorganization. According to this conference and its results were, after the war, Germany and Berlin would be split into 4 occupied zones, and Germany would be demilitarized and denazification should have been realized there. Stalin agreed to enter the war against the Empire of Japan within 90 days after the defeat of Germany, and Nazi war criminals were to be hunted down and brought to justice. In fact, Stalin's position was strong. His armies controlled the whole East and Central Europe. Don't forget that. And he declared will to control the states liberated by Red Army also after the World War II. The Red Army, the Russian forces, proceeded through Poland towards Germany. The Battle of Berlin, the final battle of the Eastern Front, started in March 1945. In desperate situation, Hitler and his wife Eva Braun committed suicide in the bunker in Reichstag on 30th April 1945. Germans officially capitulated on May the 8th, 1945. I want you to remember this date because this is when we celebrate the end of the war. Okay, so May the 8th, 1945 is an important date for me. During this battle, German troops fought to the last man, but the Soviet victory was inevitable. So here you have the capitulation of Germany, signed by the German Chief of Staff General Joll, and the surrender ceremony took place at Eisenhower's headquarters. And I will move to the American-Japanese conflict. So since the Battle of Guadalcanal, Americans had been waging heavy fighting with the Japanese from island to island. The Britons were fighting against Japan in Burma and Thailand, and Chiang Kai-shek army fought against Japan in China. I do not want you to remember that. In summer of 1945, Japan was surrounded but decided to continue the fight. After the attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan offered its capitulation. So, as you probably know, and as you can see in the picture, it was not ordinary attack. this was the first use of the atomic bomb. So these two cities were destroyed. There were people killed immediately and also after that, because there were many medical consequences, mostly caused by the radiation. One thing I need to mention is that these atomic bombs were not so strong as the ones that are, for example, nowadays. Okay, so they destroy the cities, but modern atomic bombs destroy the whole world. Okay, so these were really the first ones that were developed by the Americans. So after the Japanese capitulated on September the 2nd, 1945, the World War II, which caused the death of 55 million people, ended. So you can see here in the picture the capitulation of the Japanese. Here you have the major battle timeline, okay, but for me the very important ones are Midway, Stalingrad, El Alamein, Kursk, and Berlin. I also want to tell you something from the page 165. So you have there on the table written something about the final solution of Nazi Germany, because I didn't mention it before. I suppose you know some things about the Holocaust, and I more wanted to watch a movie that I will give you for homework, because I think it's more useful for you to see that, but at least to know some of these things. So the final solution was Nazi Germany's plan and execution of the systematic genocide of European Jews during the World War II. The systematic killing was mostly happening in the concentration camps and death camps. So in concentration camps, people were mostly working, but in death camps, there was organized killing in masses, mostly in gas chambers. The Holocaust, how do we call that, was the genocide of approximately 6 million European Jews during the World War II. Okay, and the very last thing are the consequences of the World War II. You know, there was the great technological progress, because during the war many new technologies were invented, like the sonar, radars, jet planes, V-1 and V-2 missiles, and atomic bomb, and so on. But these could be also misused for the future wars. Then the very last conference of these allies happened, and it was the Potsdam Conference that happened after the World War II. So the very last meeting of the representatives of the allies. During this conference, the Red Army was occupying Central and Eastern Europe. Britain had a new prime minister. His name was Clement Attlee. New American president was Harry Truman, and the only stable member was Stalin. The main conclusions of this conference were about the administration and the division of the occupied Germany and creation of the International War Crimes Tribunal, because all of these Nazis and the collaborators had to be given their rightful sentences. So they established the International War Crimes Tribunal that was symbolically summoned in Nuremberg, because as you know, the laws that persecuted the Jews were called the Nuremberg laws, because they were passed in the very same place. The main charges were conspiracy to wage wars of aggression, crimes against peace, war crimes, like for example murder, ill treatment of civilians and prisoners of war, deportation of civilians for slave labor, killing of hostages, crimes against humanity. You know, these are war crimes, because of course in war people are dying, but these should be just soldiers, the troops that joined the army, and not civilians, so like just the innocent people. 25 Nazis were sentenced to death. Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels committed suicide at the end of the war, so it was not possible to sentence them to death again. And Goering committed suicide during the trial. Some of them were able to escape, like for example doctor who was nicknamed Angel of the Death, Mengele. Okay, so he escaped to Argentina and so on, and also other ones. but the main representatives committed suicide before the Nuremberg trials. After the war, the two superpowers emerged, and these were the United States of America and the Soviet Union. So after the war ended, there was new order in the world because it got divided into Western Bloc and Eastern Bloc, and it was the beginning of the Cold War. So this is the end of our unit. This is all you need to know for the test. You can find everything in the online lectures. So listen to these lectures again. Have your book open all of the time so you can write some things from the lectures down, because I will definitely put it into the test, okay? So I will inform you about the date of the test. So study hard on regular basis, but stay calm as well. If you will watch these videos, if you will study from your book, focus on the things I emphasized in the videos, it will be no problem for you to pass, okay? So until the next lecture, bye.